Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar jointly hosted between KPMG and NextLabs. The topic for today's webinar is automating IT and security controls to strengthen cyber defense and improve compliance. First, to go over a few logistics, we will be recording this webinar, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who attended or registered for this webinar. Should be expecting to receive that within the next couple of days after the webinar is completed. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, can ask them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar interface. We'll be answering those either during the course of the webinar or at the end when we have a reserved time for a Q&A section. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Just to go over the agenda for today's webinar, I'll introduce the speakers I have joining me. Then we'll go through an introduction of automating IT and security controls and some challenges for industry in doing so. Then we'll talk about strengthening cyber defense and improving compliance. And then I'll talk a little bit about a solution for strengthening cyber defense and improving compliance, specifically going into some details on the NextLabs solution. Then I do have a solution demo of the NextLabs products. And then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So for an introduction, my name is Tony Burning. I'm a senior product manager here at NextLabs. Also from NextLabs, am going to be joined by Pratap Sakala. He'll be available during the Q&A section for any more technical questions. And then I will turn it over to Andrew to introduce himself and take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Reed, and I'm a director with KPMG's GRC technology practice based out of our Chicago office. I've spent the last 13 years helping clients through ERP transformations, primarily in the application security and control space. I specialize in a variety of services geared towards ERP transformation, including controls integration, analytics, process mining, security optimization, and audit readiness. So I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you all today, providing KPMG's perspective on cybersecurity controls automation. Only 3 years ago, it was unthinkable that entire workforces would be operating remotely on a regular basis. Daily interactions, entries, and processing on companies' most sacred financial ledger solutions, which not only are mission critical in their own right, but also serve as a system of record, integrating or feeding into other dozens of systems within a company's landscape. The events of last year have only continued to muddy the landscape around the already tall order of major technology implementations and establishing effective security around data. Many organizations have reported an increase in cyber attacks since COVID-19 shifted us largely to a work-from-home delivery model. KPMG recently conducted a pulse survey that asks CEOs from the world's most influential companies to provide their 3-year outlook on the economic and business landscape, as well as the ongoing global pandemic. 500 CEOs across the globe were surveyed, representing companies with annual revenues from 500 million to more than 10 billion. What we found is that as organizations accelerate their digital transformation, their focus is shifting to some of the potential risks that come along with this change. As of mid-2021, cybersecurity has climbed to the top reported risk to growth. Twice as many respondents citing cyber risk as reported in the prior year. It's challenging to keep up with the changes in technology and best practices for protecting your business and the valuable data in your possession. Remote work inherently involves certain degrees of unsecured data transmission and weaker enforcement of risk mitigating behaviors. So it's probably no shock to anyone that the global pandemic has prompted CEOs to really double down on their digital transformation strategies, intensifying their commitment to digitalization. The top area of investment for CEOs is data security, with over half of our respondents citing data security measures as their primary investment focus. IT security leaders still believe that their organizations are really unprepared for cyber attacks, despite the investments that we've already made in 2020 and the first half of 2021 calendar year. Whether you're talking about Oracle Cloud, SAP, S4HANA, SAP ECC, or any other major financial digital transformation, there's a variety of inherent risks present to organizations as their technology footprint continues to expand and processes become increasingly complex to align with dynamically changing user access and data security requirements. On top of all of this, we're also dealing with an increase in regulatory compliance. Market forces, such as rapidly evolving data protection laws, also increase the complexity and require greater responsiveness for applications and technology solutions. ERP systems are the perfect target for bad actors, both internal and external, who can attempt to take full control of ERP data, including theft of sensitive data, financial fraud, disruption of critical business processes, ransomware distribution, or potentially complete shutdown of business operations. The reality is that there is no silver bullet solution, but there are proactive things that you can do to plug holes and avoid preventable breaches. Cybersecurity patching is a great example of ensuring that backdoor vulnerabilities remain closed to external forces, but increasingly, malicious insiders have been at the forefront of sensitive data breaches as well. Even the most pristinely operated patch and configuration management processes cannot prevent an insider from obtaining access to sensitive data with credentials and authorizations provisioned by the organization. And these bad actors can carry out theft without ever stepping on the grounds of your corporate headquarters. To combat this, organizations are looking to NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for guidance on implementing best practices utilizing next generation automation and cloud ready technologies, such as attribute based access control as part of a zero trust architecture. Digital technologies are improving the performance of compliance. Interlocked with these recognizable improvements is the reality that funding of technology investments will continue to increase. 3 months ago, KPMG conducted a survey of 300 participants comprising of chief audit executives, directors, VPs, and senior managers representing compliance teams from a wide range of industry sectors across 35 countries. About 3 out of 4 respondents said they expected to continue investing in data privacy technologies. We're living in a new evolving risk landscape with a myriad of additional complexities and newly emerging threats. Preventative approaches, such as control automation and attribute-based access control, can put organizations in a better position to remain prepared and operationally resilient. Having said that, there is still generally a lower level of confidence in current state preparedness, with only 33% of respondents saying their organization is good or excellent at assessing technology risk. As mentioned a moment ago, the technology risk universe is rapidly evolving. KPMG's questionnaire also asked organizations to rank risk areas on level of importance to their organization's control frameworks. Based on the responses to the survey and our experience in advising clients on managing technology risks, key focus areas have been placed in a risk universe portrayed in this chart. The horizontal axis depicts the pace of change, from static at the left to fast moving on the right. The vertical axis indicates whether the risk tends to be external or internal. Foremost in the upper right quadrant are the primary external key areas of focus and investment. And here you will find data governance, data privacy, and cybersecurity. With these focus areas in mind, let's take a few steps backwards to understand the purpose of controls. The best way to mitigate risk is designing internal controls around organizational processes, policies, and procedures. protecting your valuable corporate assets and keeping your company secure and intact, guiding employees to carry out daily operations in a way that protects your organization and your clients. Internal controls help organizations achieve operational effectiveness. They do this through ensuring reliability of financial reporting, ensuring compliance, reducing the risk of fraud, and they increase the predictability of outcomes by reducing variance. What better way to reduce variance than through automation, which is also a perfect example of the overlap between cybersecurity and internal controls. Specifically, as an example, a focus on automation when it comes to user access provisioning, zeroing in on policy driven attribute based access, or automated asset tagging and a dynamically maintained inventory of crown jewel sensitive data. The NIST Zero Trust architecture focuses on protecting individual resources and continually evaluating risks from inside and outside the organization. And concepts like these are the crux of what we're proposing today, empowering your organization with a unified approach to address cyber defense and internal controls with a common policy-driven security control framework, relying more on preventative controls and streamlining security and control processes by reducing human intervention, eliminate or drastically reduce repetitive, time-consuming manual tasks, therefore also freeing up resources to focus on other activities. And one other thing I'd just like to quickly emphasize regarding the challenges of getting IT and security controls right, and that's the downstream impact that control failures can ultimately cause. In the spring of this year, KPMG performed a study to identify the common themes and business process areas associated with material weaknesses reported by public companies. IT software, security, and access issues have consistently been one of the top 5 issues contributing to material weaknesses. You can see here hovering just above or below 40% over the past 3 years that we've conducted this survey. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was the only issue, as material weaknesses are often the result of more than one overlapping issue or challenge, but it is undoubtedly a consistent contributor and notable trend. So, what are some of the specific challenges we've seen our clients encounter in an effort to keep data safe? Let's walk through some of the most prevalent concerns, starting with regulatory compliance. Here is where we need to understand industry and geo-specific risk landscape associated with your organization. Conduct a risk mapping exercise to identify crown jewels, the key intellectual property of your organization. A variety of different regulations could be in play, ranging from Sarbanes-Oxley to the California Consumer Privacy Act, arms and federal regulations, European General Data Protection, or HIPAA, just to name a few. Insider threats, protection of trade secrets is next. The challenge here is to effectively prevent data breaches and leakage of business critical data. With every day seeming to bring a new batch of security breaches, protecting the enterprise seems like an impossible task. As I mentioned earlier in this session, even the best patch management processes can't prevent an insider from obtaining access to sensitive data with credentials and authorizations provided by the organization. There are simply too many malicious actors and too many threats for any company to avoid compromise. It's not a matter of if, but when, and how well prepared you are for the inevitable. Next, we have consolidation of ERPs and mergers and acquisitions, which I'll cover together. This is all about protecting critical data while consolidating ERPs, working towards that ideal future state of a single global instance, or at least simplifying the IT landscape as much as we can within reason, keeping sensitive data safe while integrating new businesses, and the speed of turnaround. Sometimes you're just not in a position to completely redesign security, whether that's because of budgetary constraints, executive buy-in, expectations to sunset certain applications, or timeline constraints. Sometimes it's just more realistic to focus on the data elements that need protected rather than revamping the entire security model. And then finally here, reducing costs through automation. The idea of achieving automatic enforcement of internal control policies, requiring less manual effort and employee headcount to enforce internal controls, and ultimately achieving more consistent segregation of duties. To be more effective at strengthening security, it's important to take a risk-based approach. Understand risk from the lens of your business. A robust application security program will include preventative, detective, and reactive controls, as you can see on this slide. But the objective should really be to shift as much as you can to the left or the preventative side of the equation through automation. As shown on the slide, under the preventative piece, two low-hanging fruit areas of prevention through automation are controls around access and controls around critical data assets. So let's talk further about how we can strengthen cyber defense and improve compliance. Security requirements are becoming increasingly complex. In many cases, the traditional role-based access approach to security has become cost prohibitive, ineffective, and just unsustainable. Next generation security maximizes automation and enables a risk-based approach to efficiently manage security. Examples of this can include the deployment of automated preventative controls for critical data restrictions or data masking and data subject to emerging regulations being filtered out or masked, like I mentioned. Other examples include continuous monitoring of configuration field value checks and change logs, or exception-based alerts for higher risk areas and potential security threats, audit logging over access to sensitive data. We can drastically reduce the manual time-consuming tasks associated with traditional user provisioning controls, user access reviews, and overall security maintenance by looking at these new alternatives. One of those newer alternatives is attribute-based access control, or the ABAC model, shown here. This allows us to control user security based not on manual role assignments, but on attributes such as subject attributes like citizenship or department within the organization or HR org elements. Environmental attributes in the top right corner like geolocation, IP address, or a specific type of device that they have. Or in the bottom left, resource attributes like the author of a document or the version classification like draft versus final, or a specific file type like a PDF or a spreadsheet. The idea is that by building policies around these attributes, there's no decisions to be made. Permissions are granted based on policy triggers. Now, we're really just skimming the surface on what's possible with an ABAC security model. But with that, I'll hand it back to Tony from NextLabs to further discuss more on specific solutions for strengthening cyber defense and improving compliance.
Thanks, Andrew. So now let's talk about the data security framework, or the steps in the data security framework that applies to both cyber defense and compliance purposes. The first step is identifying what types of data you have. So is this data from customers? Is this downloads? Is this application generated data? The first step is really identifying what you have. And then that flows into the next step, which is really understanding where that data comes from, where it's stored, how it's used, and how it's shared. Once you've identified and understand those aspects of your data, then you can start to establish policies, controls, and governance models for controlling that data, making sure it stays secure. The next step then is protecting the data. So this is implementing the correct level of data protection by implementing the correct solution and implementing the controls that were defined in step number 3. And then the final step is the audit step. So reporting reporting on the data, on the steps to protect the data, any breaches, any attempts to evade the controls that have been put in place and to subvert the policies, all of that should be captured within the audit step. So NextLab's solution for strengthening cyber defense and compliance has four main pieces or pillars. And I'll go through those in greater detail in the next slide. But at a high level, the first is identifying and classifying the data. The second is protecting the data at the source, so where it would be stored. The third would be protecting the data as it's on the move or as it's being shared anytime it's moving between systems. And then finally, monitoring, auditing, and reporting on the on the data and on the application of the policies. So first, identifying and classifying the data. So in this pillar, we're looking at the data, identifying what type of data we have, identifying what is the high risk or high value data, and then focus on the applications that manage that high risk uh, and high value data. It's in this step as well that can identify whether there's any regulations or specific requirements that apply to this data. The next pillar is protecting the data at the source. So, as we've seen, over 90% of business critical data is created and managed in applications. So, protecting the data within those applications is critical. We use attribute-based access control, attribute-based security to safeguard that data um, and enforce who can access that data. And then we also automate the information control to protect the data at the source. So automating the applications of policies and access to the data so that the data is not compromised by failures of manual controls. The third pillar of protecting data on the move and when it is shared. So in the course of business processes, in the course of daily business, critical data is often extracted from its source where it's stored and then shared with other individuals or other organizations in order uh, to for business needs. This can be shared via files that are attached to emails or links that are provided to access online sources, or files could be moved directly to different systems. The important part of this pillar, this portion of the solution, though, is protecting the data at all times when it's moved. So the system needs to be designed, the controls need to be put in place so that at no point during the transfer of data is the data compromised or exposed to anyone who should not have access to it. Finally, the last phase is the monitoring, auditing, and reporting phase. So here's where we close the loop on the compliance and governance requirements. This is checking to make sure that all of the requirements that the solution is put in place to meet are being met, and not only that it's been designed in that way and implemented in that way, but can also show, improve, and have a paper trail that that the organization's in compliance and that all requirements are being met. Some pieces of that is data-centric monitoring, so really monitoring across every phase of the data lifecycle. So that's from creation to accessing, sharing, distribution, and also the end of life of any data. There's the data-centric auditing, which is auditing the times that policy is enforced, um, and when there's any activity on particular data or any policies that are in place, and making sure that all of that activity is logged, so that there is a paper trail and evidence that those policies are being enforced. And then finally is data-centric analytics. So being able to notice trends or patterns that may need further investigation, uh, the having a centralized record of times data was attempted to be accessed, and being able to find correlations or patterns across those attempts, whether they were approved or denied, to identify any potential risky behavior, any potential red flags that, again, may need to be further investigated. So with that, now I'll go into some demos of NextLabs solutions where we show the implementation and application of these frameworks. Here we have an example of a segregation of duties, or SOD compliance policies. We have two policies. One is to block sales orders for fictitious customers, and another blocks outbound delivery creations for fictitious customers. If we look at the first policy, to block sales orders, we have the description of the policy, then we have defined the scope as the create and change transactions with the deny effect. The policy has two flags: when the master data has been created by the same user, and when the master data has been changed by the same user. These two flags are from the SAP system and are passed over for policy evaluation. Here we have defined the message that is displayed to the customer when he performs an activity that is an SOD violation. So this is a simple straight deny policy. The block for outbound delivery is also the same, except for the subject components. These components are defined as specific T codes. For example, VL01N. The flag here is for master data created, which, if it is true, indicates that the same user has created the master data for this particular transaction object. The action is run, which is the default action for any transaction executed in the SAP system with respect to NextLabs. This is standard activity from a NextLabs perspective. We can also see that the same message is defined, that this is an SOD violation. This message is completely customizable by the customer. You can also maintain message classes within the SAP system. Now we're going to see the created by attribute on a customer record. Here we will look at a customer 26. And we can see that this record was created by the user G. Washington. Now we will try to create a sales order. To do this, we're going to copy an existing sales order. Now we're going to try to change the sold to party and the shipped to party to customer 26. As we saw before, this customer was created by the user G. Washington. So now we're going to try to save this order. And after the standard SAP checks, the NextLabs policy will be applied. And now we see that the error message that we had defined in the policy. This is because the policy prevents the same user from creating a customer record and then a sales order for that customer. We'll go back and see where this is defined in the policy. Here's the message text that we defined, which matches what we just saw in SAP. Now we're going to try to create a delivery for the same customer. We'll try to do this again as the same user, G. Washington. We're going to open up an existing delivery record where the ship to customer is customer 26. We try to make a change to this delivery. We try to save it, then we again get this error message that was defined in the policy. The user is not allowed to make changes and save the delivery record because they were the ones that created the customer record. Now we'll try to create a new delivery record. Again, we'll use the same customer as the ship to party. And we try to save the record. we will get the deny error. This again prevents the user that created the customer record from changing the delivery record or creating a delivery record for that customer. Now we'll go view the reports in the NextLabs Control Center. We'll choose the report for deny enforcement and run the report, and we can see the deny actions in the audit logs. In the details, we can see the specific policy, the user, the decision of the policy, as well as the data on the resource. In this case, it's customer 26. You can see the user ID is G. Washington. And here, we can see that the user has created the master data, in which case is the customer record, which is why they were denied. We can see the same in the details for the blocked sales order as well. You can see the specific transaction code, in this case VA1. We can see the message and user, G. Washington, and then the indicator that the user had created the customer record. Let's take a look at how we can use NextLabs to implement access controls for export control compliance in SAP ECC or S/4HANA. We're going to consume the classification data of materials in the SAP GTS system to enforce access controls in the SAP ECC or the S/4 system. In this scenario, there are two users, a demo user 1 and a demo user 2, whose citizenships are the United States and China respectively. There are two materials, one material RM2331, which is classified as ITAR in the SAP GTS system, and another material that is not classified. For this example, we will use the MM03 transaction, but in principle, the access controls will work the same across the entire SAP landscape. Here's the example GTS system. There is an SAP S/4 system as well as an SAP GTS system in the landscape where the classification of materials are maintained. The systems communicate with each other via an RFC or remote function call. The NextLabs platform communicates via the standard HTTPS protocol using a REST-based API. So now we can dive into the system and take a look at a basic sample policy that's defined to achieve export compliance. Here we have a top deny policy that's set to deny access to ITAR classified data in HE9. HE9 is the SAP or S/4HANA system. As you can see here, the policy is a deny policy and the subject component is empty. This means that this policy is applicable to any user across the SAP systems. There is a resource component which says Export Security ITAR, which means that any classified material that is tagged as Export Security ITAR is going to be denied for the user's access. We also specify the two systems across which this policy is applicable. In this policy, there are two systems, HE9 and the GTS system. This policy, we also specify some of the actions that users can try to execute in this transaction. If the user is denied, you can set what the user message will be, and that is defined in the obligation section. In this policy, we have it set to NextLabs ITAR classified data, no authorization. It's best principle. The way we design policies is always have a top deny policy followed by an allow exception. So, who can access the ITAR data? We're going to allow access to the ITAR data based on citizenship. Where we have an allow policy, which is a sub-policy of the deny policy, which basically says that this policy is an allow policy and the subject component citizenship status is United States. So if the user has a citizenship of the United States, then they will be able to access the data. We also need to add the SAP system to which this policy is applicable. So now if a request comes in with the user attribute of a citizen equal to the United States, the deny policy will be applied, but since the user's citizenship is United States, it will be overridden by the allow policy. In that way, the United States citizens can access this ITAR classified data. Now let's take a quick look at the SAP GTS system. So in the SAP GTS system, we have material RM223 that is replicated in from the S4 system. Also, its legal regulation classification is maintained as ITAR, and the numbering scheme is USML. Its USML number is 1A005, which is an ITAR classification number. Now let's jump to the S4 system and try to log in as a demo user 1. I'm going to try to access the material master transaction. This is MMO3. As you can see, I have the material number RM2231 here, and when I try to access the data, I can see the data. We can see the data because a demo user 1 is a United States citizen. But now, let's log in as a demo user 2 who has Chinese citizenship. We'll go to MMO3 and try to access the same material. You can see that we're not allowed to see it. And we're getting the message from NextLabs, the NextLabs policy we said earlier, which is NextLabs, ITAR classified data, no authorization. This is the message that was defined in the deny policy. So in this scenario, what has happened is that when the user tried to access the transaction MMO3 in the SAP S4HANA system, in real time, there's an RFC call that happens with SAP GTS. And it's to fetch the classification of the material once the user enters the material. So if the classification data for export security is equal to ITAR, and also the USML details are fetched and are subjected to a policy controller check. Policy controller checks for the user citizenship attribute, as well as the resource the user is trying to access, to see whether it is classified as ITAR. If it is ITAR, and the user citizenship is United States, then the user is allowed to see the data. However, if the classification is ITAR and the user's citizenship is anything other than the United States, then they will be denied access. This is what happened in the case of a demo user 2, since they are not a US citizen. As a result, they were shown the deny message that we defined in the policy. In this demo, I will show you how NextLabs DAE can be used to restrict access to sensitive data based on the IP address of the user. The policies that we define will block anyone who is attempting to access the data from an unapproved IP address. This functionality can be used to prevent a data breach, even if the user has stolen or has gained access to valid credentials. First, we're going to take a look at the policies that we'll be using to enforce these restrictions. Here in the NextLabs Control Center, we have set up two policies, one that will mask certain data and one that will filter certain data. Both of these policies are set up to restrict access to only a specified set of IP addresses. In this masking policy, we will mask data for users who are not accessing it from an approved IP address. The subject component for this policy is users who are not in the approved location. We define the app server that we want to apply this to, as well as the action, which is the select action. In the obligation section, we define the masking that we want to apply. In this case, we are masking the MENGE field of the EKPO table, and we are applying a full mask, where the symbol that it shows up instead of the masked value will be 9999. If we look at the filtering policy, we can see that some elements are similar. We're again applying the policy to users who are not in the approved location. In the resource components section, we are defining the app server and the table that we want the policy to apply to. In this case, the table is MARA. And in the obligation section, we are defining the condition to be met as the value in the MTART column is not equal to ERSA. Now we'll see how these policies are enforced within the SAP system. First, we will connect as a user from an approved location. This user will not have the masking or filtering policies applied when they attempt to access the sensitive data. Let's open up the EKPO table to see the data that have been masked. When we view the data, we can see that the values in the MNGE column have not been masked for this user. Now we will go to the MARA table. Here we can see that the user is able to see all of the records, including those that have the value of ERSA in the MTART column. Now we will connect to the SAP system with the same user, but from a system that is not in an approved location. Once again, we will first view the EKPO table. Here we can see that the values in the MENGE column have been masked with the value that was defined in the policy. Now we will go back to the MARA table. And here we can see that the records with the value ERSA in the MTART field are now filtered. This is where they would have appeared, but they are filtered out, so they're not listed. By masking and filtering based on IP address, DAE can help ensure that even if access credentials are compromised, data cannot be accessed by users who are trying to access the data from unapproved locations. Now we'll open up for any questions. As a reminder, you can ask any questions through the Zoom webinar interface. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. While I'm waiting for questions for anyone to type up their questions and answer them, I'll just remind everyone again that this webinar has been recorded, and everyone who registered or attended the webinar will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. That recording, obviously view it yourself, but then also please feel free to share it with anyone else who may find it useful or valuable. So now we'll go to questions. One question that I have is, given that we demonstrated just SAP solutions in this webinar, whether this supports other applications, and the answer to that is yes. So the NextLab solutions do support integrating with other products. It's like any ODBC, JDBC databases for DAE. But yeah, we do support other systems as well, even though the systems demonstrated today were SAP systems. While I pause and wait for questions, there was a few questions asked about CPE credit, and some of those were answered during the course of the webinar. But the answer is that no, this webinar does not apply for CPE credit. While I wait for any more questions, I'll also pause here and see if Andrew or Pratab, who are also with us right now, would like to add anything else.
Yeah, sure. One other thing that I'll add, Tony, that I'm not quite sure if it came fully across during the demos, but when you set up these policies in NextLabs, you don't need to specify specific transactions. Really, you're handling these data restrictions at the table level, the application tables, and so any transaction relying on that table data is going to have those same restrictions applied. And I think that's a really huge benefit of this DAE solution from NextLabs, which is just the breadth of coverage and just ensuring that no matter where a user is going to access that data through the standard SAP transactions or even through customized transactions, you're going to have those restrictions consistently applied.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Yeah, so NextLab is like DAE product that operates at the data access layer. So it's specific transaction agnostic. However, the protected data is being accessed. The policies will get evaluated and enforced in real time when they're accessed. So that is a good point. We also do have other components of the solution that work in the application layer as well. There are some things that are best enforced at the data access layer, and some things that are best enforced at the application layer. And so really we have complementary products, parts of the solution to address both of those needs. Not seeing any other questions come in right now. Pause just another minute, give everyone a chance. Oh, well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank everyone once again for joining us today. Please feel free to, if you do have questions afterwards, to follow up with us, and we'll get back to you and answer all of your questions. And again, expect to get an email with a link to the webinar recording within the next couple of days, and share that to anyone that you think would find it valuable. But thanks once again.
Great. Thanks, everyone.